Today in Bloomburrow, it's gonna be a big one. We get special guests, imagined critters, and a bunch of other bonkers cards from the main set, which means we should probably break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron-Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Bloomburrow spoilers. And it's gonna be a big one today. We're nearing the end of Bloomburrow spoilers. Actually, today might be our last main set video. I'm not 100% sure. I know we got all the mythics. I think we have most of the rares. We'll have to wait and see. We might have one more video tomorrow if we have enough stuff. Otherwise, Commander Precons coming on Thursday, so keep an eye out for those on the Commander YouTube. But today we have a huge, amazingly awesome list of cards to talk about. We get a bunch of special stuff, some reprints, the imagined critters, planeswalkers as animal cards, and some of the strongest cards from the main set that are definitely going to shake up Standard and maybe other formats too, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Bloomburrow cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Bloomburrow. First up today, we get to see what a Merfolk looter would look like if it was a mythic from 2024 rather than a common from, I don't know, 1994, sometime around then, in Kitsa Otterball Elite. And this card is sort of ridiculous. It's a 2-mana 1/3 legendary otter wizard. It has vigilance. It also has prowess. It also taps to loot, draw a card, and discard a card. And you can pay to untap it to copy an instant or sorcery spell you control. You can choose new targets for the copy, but you can only do this if its power is 3 or greater, which works really well with the prowess. If you cast 2 spells, its power will be high enough that then you can start copying additional spells. And I think that Kitsa is a really, really good card. If you think about what this is, it's essentially Merfolk Looter, but it's got Harmonic Prodigy stats in its prowess ability. But then you can also use it to copy spells like a twin cast, and it's worth mentioning that Vigilance plays really well on this card, because what you can do is cast a couple spells during your pre-combat main phase to grow its power. You can attack with Kitsa, and once it's declared as an attacker, then you could like cast an instant and then tap it and pay the mana to copy it and get more copies out of it while still having Kitsa attacking. So the Vigilance actually makes this card even more powerful than it looks. So I think there's a pretty strong argument that Kitsa might be the new best looter of all time. So I think right now I would argue Rona, Herald of Invasion, the best looter of all time. It used to be Jace Vryn's Prodigy, but that's kind of got trumped by Rona. I think that Kitsa, while it doesn't go in the same decks as Rona, it goes in very different decks, honestly. I think it's of that power level, or maybe even a higher power level. Rona really wants you to play a bunch of legends. That's kind of Rona's gimmick, because on taps itself works well with Relic of Legends. Kitsa is a straight up Spellslinger style looter, but in a Spellslinger deck, this card is very, very strong. So what do we actually do with this card in Standard? First off, if you're playing otters, you're probably playing some number of Kitsas. One of the nice things about Bloomburrow is the creature type kind of tells you what deck the card goes in. So otters, all about slinging spells, storming off, copying each other as you cast spells, reducing the cost on spells, giving everything prowess. Kitsa fits perfectly in that deck. And one of the nice things about Kitsa is a lot of times when you see a 2-mana legend, you're like, okay, that's really good, but how many of these can I actually play in my deck? Am I just going to be legend ruling myself too much? And with Kitsa, I don't think it really matters because of its looting ability. If you have a Kitsa on the battlefield and you draw a second one, you can always just loot away the second one to find a new card. So it's one of those legends that doesn't really punish you very much for playing 4 copies of it. So if otters are a thing, I think Kitsa definitely going to be a part of it. It might be even better in just a straight up prowess deck. We got Monastery of Sorcerer, we got Slick Shot Show Off. Kitsa works really well there as well, where it gives you another prowess threat that can also get through extra lands with its looting ability. The Vigilance is nice, and then you can copy spells to get even more value out of it. So I think we'll see Kitsa in Standard for sure. In Standard, I expect most of the time, you're just going to be copying whatever cheap spells you happen to want in your deck anyway, right? You're playing your Shocks or whatever replaces Consider after rotation. And Kitsa's ability, yeah, it's not like insane if you copy a Consider, but it's perfectly fine. A way to draw an extra card or get some more damage out of a burn spell. However, what I really want to do with Kitsa is use it to copy Doppelgang. I'm kind of addicted to Doppelgang. It's one of my favorite cards from the last year. And what's better than a Doppelgang? 2 Doppelgangs with Kitsa copying it. So I don't know if this will be a very good deck. It probably won't be a very good deck, but imagine how many copies you can get. If you use Kitsa to copy a Doppelgang and cast it twice instead of once. The other place I think this card is going to see some play is back in Pioneer. So obviously it's a wizard. So if you're playing like Historic Wizards or Pioneer Wizards, it fits really well in that deck, which is already like a prowessy Spellslinger deck. But this could show up in some sort of like Arclight Phoenix shell. It plays really, really well with the big delve draw cards, Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time. We already see like Arclight Phoenix and Pioneer playing Galvanic Iteration, primarily to copy Treasure Cruise. Kitsa can kind of do the same thing where you cast a couple spells, which you already want to do because you're a Phoenix deck and that's your whole gimmick. And then once you grow Kitsa, you cast your Treasure Cruise and then it exiles a bunch of cards. Kitsa copies it, you refill your hand. So it'll be interesting to see if some of these show up in Phoenix on top of the Wizards deck. In Commander, I think the best comparison for Kitsa is it's kind of a mono blue Stella. So Stella also has an ability where it can tap to copy instant or sorcery spell you control. You can choose new targets. You had to have cast at least 3 spells in the turn to do it. Kitsa's kind of the same, right? You need to grow its power, most commonly by casting some spells, and then you can use it to copy a spell. And this means that Kitsa, I think in Commander, is mostly going to be a combo commander. It's really easy to go infinite with Kitsa in Dramatic Reversal. So Dramatic Reversal, 2-mana instant that untaps all your non-land permanents. So what you need to do to go infinite here is you need to get Kitsa's power up to 3 so it can copy stuff, and then get some artifacts that can produce mana on the battlefield, like Soul Rings or Hedron Archives. And then what you do is you cast a Dramatic Reversal, and then with the reversal on the stack, use Kitsa to copy the Dramatic Reversal. You can float all your mana rock mana in between, so hopefully you float like 4 mana, and then it's only 2 mana to copy it with Kitsa, so then you're generating mana every time you go through the loop. Dramatic Reversal untaps Kitsa, and all your mana rocks, do it again, do it again. You get an infinite mana that you should be able to use to win the game, which is actually something Stella Lee does as well. And there's other cards that can do this too. A Turnabout does the same thing, Breaking Wave. Intellectual Offering might be the best way to do it. It's more expensive, but if you actually have enough mana of mana rocks to go infinite with Intellectual Offering, not only do you get an infinitely big Kitsa, and not only do you make infinite mana, you also get to draw your entire deck, or actually just kill an opponent maybe by milling them out by making them draw their entire deck. So Kitsa, the card's kind of absurd. It is very much a 2024 card where it takes this simple archetype from Magic's past as a Merfolk Looter, and then it just stacks on so many abilities, so much tech, so much toughness compared to past versions of the card that I think this card, standard playable for sure, Pioneer playable probably, and Commander, super strong infinite combo mono blue commander. We also got a new frog 1-drop in Valley Mightcaller. So a 1-mana 1/1 with Trample. It's a green card, and it says whenever another frog, rabbit, raccoon, or squirrel you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So if Valley Mightcaller looks familiar, that's because it's essentially Champion of the Perished, or Champion of the Perished. Well done on that one, Wizards. Too bad they couldn't fit in some sort of Perish pun here, but still, it works the same way, right? These cards, whenever you play a human or a zombie, you get a counter on it. Valley Mightcaller, same type of formatting, except it cares about frogs, rabbits, raccoons, and squirrels. The big upside, the downside, of course, is those tribes are not as strong as humans or zombies. There's just less frogs and rabbits and raccoons and squirrels running around. The big upside, though, is it does have Trample, and a Champion of the Perished, or Champion of the Perished, that has Trample is a very, very scary card. So my first instinct when I see a card like this, a card that says, I care about frogs and rabbits and raccoons and squirrels, is you want to play it in the deck of whatever creature type it is. So it's going to be at its best in a frog deck, right? Because when you play another frog, it's going to trigger it. Additional copies are going to trigger itself. So I think it's going to be at its best in a frog deck. And frogs do work with this ability in a weird way. They're not really a go wide tribe, but because frogs are all about bouncing your own creatures back to your hand, you can keep picking up your own stuff, replaying it, triggering your Mightcaller to make it really, really big. But I think this card is so strong that I think it's a frog that could actually show up in like rabbits, because rabbits are so good at going wide. Imagine Valley Mightcaller into hop to it, put 3 counters on it, you got a 4/4 trampler, or Season of the Burrow, make 5 rabbits, put 5 counters on it, all of a sudden you get a 6/6 trample. And in older formats in specific, it also works really well with squirrels, even though it's a frog, because squirrels are also about going wide. They got lots of cards that just put a ton of squirrels on the battlefield. If you go infinite squirrel nest combo, you're gonna make an infinitely big Valley Mightcaller that's just gonna one-shot kill your opponent. So even though it's a frog, and I think that's going to be its primary home, I think it might be strong enough to show up in squirrel and rabbit decks, even though it's the wrong creature type, just because it works so well with the go-wide theme of those tribes. We also got, speaking of frogs, Dour Port-Mage, a 2-mana 1/3 frog wizard that says whenever one or more creatures you control leave the battlefield without dying, draw a card, and then you can pay 2 and tap it to bounce another target creature you control to its owner's hand. So Dour Port-Mage essentially rewards you for blinking or bouncing your own stuff. You play a creature, you ephemera it, you draw a card. It is worth mentioning that it's one or more creatures, so if you have like Lazelle's Acrobatics or Ghostway or something that's going to exile your entire team, still can only draw one card if those creatures are exiled all at the same time, but still this can generate a lot of value once it gets going, and it plays really well with the frog theme of picking up your own stuff, of blinking your own stuff. Most of the frogs we've seen, in one way or another, let you blink your own creatures, bounce them back to your hand to replay them, and Dour Port-Mage just sits out and generates card advantage every time you're doing this, so it seems like a really strong card advantage engine. Frogs are one of the weirdest tribes, I think, from Bloomburrow. I really wonder how good they're going to be. I think they look like one of the most fun tribes to play out of the entire set. Just like, the play pattern is so unique. We haven't really had a tribal deck that's built around bouncing your own things and blinking your own things. So I think it's going to be really unique. My question is, how strong is it going to be? And that's what I don't really know. I think that's going to be what determines how good Dour Port-Mage is. If frogs are good enough to see play, Dour Port-Mage probably going to be a part of it. It's just an engine piece for that deck. It also works in a weird way as Sunfall Protection. Because remember, this says whenever one or more creatures you control leaves the battlefield without dying, this means if your opponent exiles your team with a Sunfall, you get to draw a card. If you get Swords to Plowshare, you get to draw a card. And as we talked about before, any sort of blink effects, Ghostly Flicker, Ephemera, that's also going to draw you cards with Dour Port-Mage. In older formats, it's also super good with Shrieking Drake. Shrieking Drake just came to Modern and Modern Horizons 3, also to Magic Arena for the first time. Just a 1-mana 1/1 flyer, then when it comes into play, you bounce a creature back to your hand. The trick about Shrieking Drake is it doesn't say another creature, so essentially if you have a Dour Port-Mage out, you can play Shrieking Drake for 1 mana, pick it up to its own ability, draw a card with Dour Port-Mage. So essentially it's pay 1 blue mana as many times as you want to draw a card, which is actually pretty strong once it gets going. So it might have a home in like Primal Prayers combo that already wants Shrieking Drake because it's one of its combo pieces. Maybe this can be a backup plan or an engine piece to help draw into the Primal Prayers. Same with like Alorian, which works a lot like Primal Prayers. So Dour Port-Mage, if you're playing a blink deck or some sort of self-bounce deck, seems like a really, really cool card. We'll have to wait and see just how strong frogs actually are in Standard. I'm really hoping they make it because it just looks like such a fun deck to play. Not sure though, it's kind of hard to judge their power, but if frogs do make it, Dour Port-Mage couldn't be a big member of that tribe. We also got some new reanimation in Coiling Rebirth. So Coiling Rebirth, 5 mana black sorcery, says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then you can gift an opponent a card, and if you give a gift and that creature isn't legendary, you create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1. So Coiling Rebirth, I think this card's kind of fine, right? We have a lot of 5 mana reanimation in Standard. Cruelty of Gix, probably the best option, I would say. That Emergence, No One Left Behind, don't really see play. Coiling Rebirth, it can be very, very strong in a very narrow set of circumstances. So where this card could outshine these other options is if you're specifically trying to reanimate a non-legendary creature, probably with a powerful ETB trigger. So if you think about what you're most commonly going to reanimate, a lot of times it's like a Troxa or a Tally, or sometimes people play Cruelty of Gix kind of for value in a mono black deck, and you're getting like a Shieldred or an Aclazotz. Coiling Rebirth is way worse than the other options with these cards because they're all legends, right? So it doesn't really do anything at all except reanimate a creature. If you're just reanimating a creature, you might as well play Cruelty of Gix, which has a bunch of other upsides, or even some of the other cards. On the other hand, if you're trying to reanimate, let's say a Vaultborn Tyrant, or maybe a Hostile Investigator, or maybe Sunspine Lynx, then Coiling Rebirth can actually be very, very powerful. The gift of giving your opponent an extra card to get a 1/1 Vaultborn Tyrant that's gonna trigger and draw you a bunch of cards, or a second Hostile Investigator, Investigator to make your opponent discard the card that you just made them draw, or a Sunspire Lynx to deal a ton of damage, that is totally going to be worth it. So I think Coiling Rebirth, the fact that you can get that 1/1 copy, does give it relevance. I'm just not sure that there's going to be a deck for it, because most of the common reanimation targets are legendary, so you're going to have to be like non-legendary reanimator. In that context, Coiling Rebirth, really good. Just keep in mind, it doesn't really work with a lot of the most popular reanimation targets. Next up, we get our final mythic from the main set, and it is a good one in Eluge the Shoreless Sea. So, a 4-mana star. You need triple blue mana. It's a legendary elemental fish. It says its power and toughness are each equal to the number of islands you control. When it enters or attacks, put a flood counter on target land. It's an island in addition to its other types for as long as it has a flood counter on it. And then, the big one, the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn costs a blue or a generic less to cast for each land you control with a flood counter on it. So if you think about this card, it's 4 mana, so let's say you play islands each turn. It's going to be a 4 mana 4/4, plus it can turn your other lands into islands in addition to its other types, so it helps grow itself. The second ability just boosts the last ability. That last ability, though, is the absurd one. We see cost reduction effects in Magic, but they almost never apply to colored mana, which essentially means they can't make spells free. But this, since it applies to blue mana, can literally make your blue spells free, and that's what makes this card so incredibly scary in a control deck. So if you think about comparisons, it's kind of a Serpent of the Endless Sea. Really bad comparison because that's a random old common, but essentially it's a creature that gets really big if you get a lot of islands. And then you get an Aquatex Will, where you're turning lands into islands in addition to its other types. I guess you could use it on your opponent's land, although I don't know why you would with this card, because remember, it's islands in addition to its other types. So you're not going to be turning the land just into an island to like mana screw your opponent. And then the last mode, I put up Sapphire Medallion as a comparison, although really, we've never seen an effect like this before, because what this does is you play this, you put the first flood counter on a land, you can immediately cast a 1 mana blue spell for free. So you can consider or ponder or brainstorm, and then it's worth pointing out that this says each turn, not on each of your turns. So then you can cast another 1 mana blue spell for free on your opponent's turn, but then the next turn, let's say you attack with this, now you can start casting 2 mana blue spells for free. So you can counterspell, you can mana drain, you can mana leak, doesn't matter. And remember, this can play for generic mana cost as well. So this card just keeps spiraling and spiraling. Eventually, if you get enough flood counters, this can be a free Seagate Restoration, or Expropriate, or an Enter the Infinite, where you're just casting these massive game-ending effects for free. So I think this card is borderline busted. I think this card is absolutely absurd. It does everything you want as a control finisher, and it's also worth pointing out, it does work with X effects as well. You can use the colorless reduction to reduce the colorless X of like Blue Sun Zenith or Mass Manipulation after you reduce all the blue mana symbols in it. So you can be casting these cards for free with massive X's as well. So I think Eluge is just a kind of insane card. So if you think about what you do with this card, outside of just playing it by itself as a kind of a self-supporting control finisher, where you play this and get a big body and put a counter on your lands and reduce the cost on your spells so you can protect it with free counter spells, there are a few other cards in Magic that work with flood counters. Not a ton of them. We talked about Aquatex Will. The best is probably Quicksilver Fountain, which at the beginning of each player's upkeep puts a flood counter on target non-island land that they control, and the land turns into a straight up island, not in addition to its other types. So it's kind of like this weird slow blood moon. And at the end of turn, if all lands in play are islands, you get to remove all flood counters from them. So that's a bit of a drawback. If you actually get to the point where all the lands are islands, it would actually power down your Eluge, but it does help speed things up, because every turn you're going to be able to add a free flood counter to a land with Quicksilver Fountain to cast bigger things for free with Eluge. But I don't think that's really how you play the card. I think in Standard, this just seems like a good control card. Think of the Haughty Jin style control decks, where you're just trying to like stick a threat or two and then counter everything your opponent draws, draw a bunch of cards. This seems built for that play style. You can play this and you can immediately start casting spells for free. Once you get 2 counters, you can start casting your counter spells for free. It's also worth mentioning that the flood counters stick around if Eluge dies. So let's say you play an Eluge, you put a counter on one of your lands, it's going to be an island in addition to its other types as long as Eluge's on the battlefield. But Eluge dies, the land's still going to have the counter. It will no longer be an island because Eluge's not out there with its ability, but it'll still have the counter on it, which means if you play a second Eluge, you're going to have that first counter, so you're going to start at a higher higher baseline essentially, because you're going to have more flood counters on your lands with the second one compared to the first one. So I think in some sort of like Haughty Jhin style deck, this card seems ridiculous. So you just slam it and get so much value out of it and use it to beat your opponent down. I could even see it seeing play in multicolor decks. Like, yes, it only reduces the blue or colorless of a spell, but still, this is working with Sunfall or No More Lies or 3 Steps Ahead, giving you a discount on those spells. So it seems like a great control finisher. And even though a 2-color control deck isn't going to have all islands, the fact that you can use Eluge to turn your non-islands into islands helps support its other abilities and power it up even more. I think the card might be even better in older formats in some ways. The big upside in older formats is there's a lot of 1-mana counter spells. Think about Modern or maybe Timeless. You can play Eluge and then immediately cast a free Stubborn Denial. If you got 4 islands, Eluge's going to be 4 power, so it's just a hard counter for non-creature spells, or your Spell Pierce, or an offer you can't refuse. So there's a bunch of 1-mana ways to protect this, and then if you get an attack the next turn, then your counter spells turn into Force of Wills, your mana drains turn into Force of Wills, which just gets more and more insane. And I think the same is mostly true of Commander. If you're playing like a mono blue heavy Commander deck with a bunch of counter spells, a bunch of instants and sorceries, this seems like an easy inclusion to your deck. And if you build this as your Commander, I think you're just playing a full-on like Brawl style control deck where you're just so overloaded with counters, you just try to keep your opponents from really doing anything. So Eluge, I'm actually surprised they printed this card. That last ability is just so unique and so rare that I have to think this card has potential to be somewhere between really, really good and busted, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. We also got an interesting new turtle in Fecund Greenshell. So a 5-mana 4/6 elemental turtle. It is reach. It says as long as you control 10 or more lands, creatures you control get +2/+2. And then whenever it or another creature you control with toughness greater than its power enters, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, you can put it in the battlefield tapped, otherwise put it into your hand. So Fecund Greenshell, not really sure why this ground-bound turtle has reach, but that's neither here nor there. This card is actually very powerful. If you think about what it is, once you get up to 10 lands, which its ability is going to help you do, plus if you're playing like Commander, it's so easy to ramp up to 10 lands, you essentially get the positive aspects of Elesh Norm. Giving your team +2/+2 is a very powerful static buff. Most importantly, this generates card advantage like Coiling Oracle. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you're going to get a Coiling Oracle trigger. Whenever another higher than power toughness creature enters the battlefield, you're going to get another Coiling Oracle trigger, which is an absurd amount of value. It essentially means it's like a Risen Reef that's more mana but a much bigger body for high toughness creatures, and we've seen Risen Reef really pop off. The big downside of Risen Reef is it's just so small, so it dies to everything, but Fecund Greenshell doesn't really have this problem. So in some sort of Toughness Matters deck, I think this card can be absolutely ridiculous. A few months ago, we played this Pride of the Hullclad deck with like Pride of the Hullclad, Bedrock Tortoise, Walking Bulwark, and Fecund Greenshell seems perfect for the deck. It's got high toughness, it's going to generate card advantage whenever any of your other creatures are coming into play, so I would play it there for sure, but it might be even better than just a Butts card, a Toughness Matter card. If you look at some of the popular cards in Standard, there's not a ton, but there's some really good ones that just naturally happen to have higher toughness and power. So like Sheoldred, for example, Novice Inspector, Preacher of the Schism, plus Greenshell's going to trigger itself, so maybe you can just build like a Golgari mid-range deck where you're playing a bunch of really good cards that just happen to have higher toughness and power to work with Greenshell's ability to use it as a card advantage engine and eventually to pump your creatures. Also worth pointing out, this does not say non-token creatures, which means Greenshell can do some absurd things with Avenger Zendikar, Phaleth, Kozilek's Command, these cards that can create a bunch of 0/1 tokens. So let's say you get down Greenshell and you got a bunch of lands in play, then you play Avenger of Zendikar, it's going to make like 10 0/1 plants, however many lands you have, and then each of those plants is going to trigger Greenshell. You're going to draw so many cards and ramp so much, same with Phaleth or Kozilek's Command, so some of those shenanigans seem really powerful. I think if you're playing a Commander deck that's kind of like a rampy green deck with Avenger of Zendikar, I think Fecund Greenshell is worth playing just because it synergizes so well with that plan. The other place that this works in Commander is in Toughness Matters decks, right? There's a few decks in Commander that are all about just having these high toughness creatures. Arcades, even though Greenshell's not a Defender, I think it's probably still good enough because it's going to trigger when all your walls come into play. Doran, Pride of the Whole Clan, Akira Shaddiq, Sapling of Colnifer. It's even really good in Disa. Disa is maybe the most interesting home because Disa cares specifically about Lurgoyfs. However, your Lurgoyfs, all the Tarmogoyf tokens that it makes, are always going to have higher toughness and power. So as you're making the tokens with Disa, they're going to be triggering Greenshell. So I think I'd play it there as well. So a really sweet card for any deck that can trigger it a lot, which is mostly going to be these high toughness decks. But those Avenger of Zendikar style decks might actually be the most explosive shell for the turtle. We also got our janky red enchantment from the set in Festival of Embers. So 5 red mana for an enchantment. This is during your turn. You can cast instants and sorcery spells from your graveyard by paying 1 life in addition to their other costs. But if a card or token would be put in your graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. And then you can pay 2 mana to sacrifice Festival of Embers. So if you're going to kill yourself from its damage, or you need to use your graveyard, you can always get rid of it. So if you think about what this card is, it's essentially Past in Flames. Worst Past in Flames, I think. It's Past in Flames. It is static, so it can just stick out on the battlefield, but it's a Past in Flames that is going to exile any future cards that go into your graveyard. With Past in Flames, if you cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, it's going to go into exile. However, with Festival of Embers, if you cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, it's going to go into exile. But if you cast anything else or anything dies, it's also going to go into exile, which makes it a worst Past in Flames. It's definitely way worse than Underworld Breach, so I don't think we're going to be seeing this card at all in like Modern or Legacy, because there's just way stronger options that do a similar thing. The question is, could this work in Standard? And I think the answer is maybe. I'm not fully convinced of this one, but if it is going to work, it's probably going to be in like an Otter Stormshire shell, where you play your game and you cast a bunch of spells and you do your things, and then in the late game when your graveyard's nice and full, you essentially try to use it like a Past in Flames, where you're going to play this, and then that turn or the following turn, you just cast enough spells that you're going to win with your Crustacean Mages and your Valley Flood Colors and your Stormbreakers. So I think in the right deck, in Standard in specific, because there's better options in older formats, I think it could work as like Past in Flames at home, Underworld Breach at home, but I do think the restrictions on it do make it pretty narrow. You don't want to be exiling all your graveyard stuff. You don't want to be taking all that damage as you're casting your spells. So there are a lot of restrictions on it, but I do think in that very specific circumstance, this could be a good option for like Otter Storm or something. We also got a rare lizard in Gev's Scalded Scorch. So a 2-mana 3/2 Rakdos legendary lizard mercenary. It has Ward of Pay 2 life. It says other creatures you control enter with an additional +1/+1 counter on them for each opponent who lost life this turn. So in Standard or Modern or whatever, always going to be 1 extra counter because you got 1 opponent. It does scale for Commander though, so if you can hit 3 opponents for damage, you get 3 counters. And then whenever you cast a lizard spell, it deals 1 damage to target opponent. So Gev is a kind of interesting card. It's essentially like Vampire Socialite, I guess, where as long as you damage an opponent, your stuff's coming into play with an extra +1/+1 counter. Thankfully, it doesn't care specifically about lizards there. That was part of the problem with Socialite, right? Is it only work with vampires? Vampires weren't really good enough, but Gev works with any creature, so it doesn't have to be a lizard card. The last ability only works with lizards, but the +1/+1 counter ability, you could play that in just a generic aggro deck of some kind. The other comparison is something like a Grumgully the Generous, so you need to get in damage to make it work. But if you can make an opponent lose life, you kind of get a Grumgully at a discount. And there are some Grumgully combos that this could help support. So as far as Standard is concerned, my big concern for Gev is lizards seem to be the least powerful tribe in all of Bloomburrow. If you just go through and look at like rabbits or squirrels or whatever, and then compare them to lizards, lizards seem pretty far behind. Like, I just don't think they're going to be good enough to be a Standard deck. Yeah, Hired Claw is fine. I guess Fireglass Mentor, Thoughtstalker Warlock, they're fine. And I was wondering, why are they so bad? Why are all these other creature types so strong in Bloomburrow, where like rabbits look really, really good, mice look really, really good, and then lizards are kind of like, we get a couple of okay rares and some janky lore rarity stuff. And then I realized the reason for this, and the reason is, this isn't actually a lizard card, and lizards don't need as much support as mice mice or rabbits because it's actually an Outlaws card. It's, I think, supposed to synergize with some of the cards that we saw in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. It turns out that some of the crime cards in the Outlaw cards, like Laughing Jasper Flint, Hellspur Posse Boss, happen to be lizards. So I think what you actually are supposed to do with this card is not play like a lizard deck, but play it in an Outlaw style deck where you play Gev and then you play like Laughing Jasper Flint, who happens to be a lizard. That'll trigger the Gev, and Laughing Jasper Flint will get an extra counter, so it'll be a 5/4, plus that 1 damage that it deals when you cast a lizard, like Laughing Jasper Flint or Hellspur Posse Boss, is going to commit a crime, so that also turns on all your other crime cards. So I think that's why lizards are less powerful than the other creature types. A lot of the other creature types, like squirrels or mice, don't really do much with the other sets in Standard, but lizards in specific really synergize with the last set, with Outlaws of Thunder Junction, with the Outlaw theme, and the Mercenary theme, and the Crime theme. So I think that Wizards powered them down and printed less of them, knowing that they already had additional support for Standard. So I think that's where Gev is most likely to see play. Not in a dedicated lizard deck, but in some sort of Outlaw deck that is playing the good Outlaw Wizards to work with Gev. The other thing about this card is it can be a combo piece. I mentioned before Grumgully. Its main purpose is to be a combo piece. The easiest combos with this card are persist combos. So you have a card like Putrid Goblin or Murderous Redcap. These are creatures that when they die, if they didn't have a -1/-1 counter on them, you return into play with a -1/-1 counter on them. So the way that Magic rules work is a creature can't have a +1/+1 counter and a -1/-1 counter. If that happens, they just cancel each other out. So the idea is you like play Gev, you make sure that your opponent has dealt damage to turn on its +1/+1 counter ability, and then you have like a Putrid Goblin. You sack it to, let's say, Goblin Bombardment. You ping your opponent for 1 with a Goblin Bombardment. When the Putrid Goblin dies, it's going to come back into play with a -1/-1 counter, but it's going to get the +1/+1 counter from Gev. They'll cancel each other out, so you just get a normal Putrid Goblin again. So this means you can just sacrifice it an infinite number of times and deal infinite damage with Goblin Bombardment. If you have Murderous Redcap instead of Putrid Goblin, it deals damage when it comes into play. So those are the kind of synergies that you could build around if you're building like a Gev commander deck or whatever. Could also work in Modern. We've played some of these persist combos in Modern, in Timeless, in Historic before, and Gev does seem like a nice addition there. The only concern is you do have to get in damage to turn it on. So there might be some very sad scenarios where you kind of have the entire combo set up, but you can't get in that damage to get the counters going. Although if Goblin Bombardment's your sack outlet, it should be fine. The other thing to mention about this card is in Commander, if you can make sure you're hitting all of your opponents each turn, this actually makes your creatures really, really big. A 2-drop that puts 3 +1/+1 counters on each of your creatures is kind of a ridiculous aggro card. Reminds me a little bit of like a way cheaper Master Biomancer in some sense. So if you can build your deck to make sure that each opponent's taking damage during your turn, this is just a very, very aggro powerful anthem that's going to make all your creatures super big super quickly. We also got Keen-Eyed Curator, probably better known as the raccoon version of Scavenging Ooze, a double green 3/3 2-drop raccoon scout. This is as long as there's 4 more card types among cards exiled with it. It gets +4/+4 in trample, so it'll be a 7/7 trampler, and then you can pay a generic mana to exile target card from a graveyard. So this is literally Scavenging Ooze, essentially, with a couple of twists. It's the 2-drop that can exile cards from the graveyard. This also starts off bigger. It's got like Werewolf Pack Leader stats, so it's a better stompy card right away. I think compared to Scavenging Ooze, it's actually an interesting conversation. Which one of these is better? I actually lean towards Keen-Eyed Curator, assuming that double green mana is not a problem for your deck. If you can cast both of these cards just as easily, I think I'd rather have Keen-Eyed Curator. Scavenging Ooze does gain life, which is relevant, but it only grows when you exile a creature card from the graveyard, and you need green mana to activate it. Keen-Eyed Curator will grow once you exile 4 different card types of cards from the graveyard. So in theory, you could exile just 4 total cards and get this up to a 7/7 trampler, which is kind of scary, and you can activate it for generic mana. Plus, I mean, raccoons are just cooler than oozes, so tiebreaker goes to the raccoon. So I think Keen-Eyed Curator, really good mono green stompy card. It's basically a twist on Scavenging Ooze. It should see standard play if green is good, which we'll have to wait and see. Green hasn't been good in a long time, but it's a very powerful, essentially upgrade upgraded for 2024 version of Scavenging Ooze. We also got a little class enchantment that might secretly be one of the scariest cards from the entire set. So 1 black mana for Scavenger's Talent. Its first level is whenever 1 or more creatures you control die, create a food token only once each turn. So level 1, kinda jank. Level 2 for 2 mana is the big one. Whenever you sack a permanent, target player mills 2 cards. And then level 3 for 3 mana, also kind of exciting. At the beginning of your end step, you can sack 3 other non-land permanents. If you do, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Finality counter means if the creature dies, it goes to exile and set it back in the graveyard. So why is Scavenger's Talent so impressive? And the answer is really that second mode. That second mode, which is uncapped, right? It's not once per turn or anything. Whenever you sack a permanent, target player mills 2 cards. That can do some really, really scary things. So if you think about what this is, level 1, you make a food. I guess it's Curious Pair or something, adventure mode. Level 2, the best comparison I could find is it's kind of like Teferi's Tutelage, but for sacrificing rather than for drawing cards. And the last mode is kind of like a 3 mana Virtue of Persistence. Yes, it only returns cards from your graveyard, so that is a little bit worse. And they do have a finality counter, but once you get there, just reanimating something every single turn, assuming you're a deck that has a bunch of sack fodder, keep that in mind. You do need to sacrifice 3 things, but assuming you got a bunch of food tokens, let's say, or other like useless sack fodder on the battlefield, can be very powerful. Plus, you don't have to do that. That's a May ability. So if you don't have stuff you want to sack, you can always just skip that. You don't need to reanimate too many things for this to actually be worth it. So the second level on this card is really what makes it so scary. This is a ridiculous payoff for any sort of sacrifice combo deck. So obvious combo, Gravecrawler, infinite combo. If you have Gravecrawler and another zombie, you can just like sack Gravecrawler to Phyrexian Altar and then recast it using the mana you made with Phyrexian Altar from your graveyard. Essentially, you'll sacrifice Gravecrawler an infinite number of times, which means you can just use this to mill the entire table out of the game. It's a win con in that combo. Also, it works really well with something like Rally the Ancestors combo. We've played some of these combos in the past. I used to love Rally the Ancestors, and the idea of these combos is you try to get a bunch of creatures in your graveyard with some Blood Artists and a sack outlet, then you Rally the Ancestors them all back into play, and then you sack them all and burn your opponent out of the game with Blood Artist. The thing that makes Scavenger's Talent so sweet in this deck is it can be a win condition to mill your opponent out, but it can also be a support piece to fill your graveyard. In the early game, when you're kind of setting things up, you can sack some stuff to mill yourself to fill your graveyard to set up a bigger Rally the Ancestor that then will put so many creatures into play. You can win the game either with Blood Artist or by milling your opponent out of the game. So I really like that that second level can mill yourself as well as your opponent. I think that's going to be really relevant. Also seems like it could be good in like Cauldron Familiar, Witch's Oven decks. We've seen Asmore food decks. These decks that like want to fill their graveyard, they're sacrificing things. You can use this to fill your own graveyard, eventually turn it on your opponent. So I think at 1 mana, this card is in the conversation from standard all the way back to modern, at least in the right deck. It's just so efficient at what it does that I think this is a card that we're going to see showing up in some interesting combo builds all over the place. Also in standard, seems like a sweet finisher for some of the Pitiless Carnage decks. We've seen like Pitiless Carnage Aftermath Analyst decks, where the idea is you're gonna like sacrifice all your lands, get them back with Aftermath Analysis, do it again, sack them all to Pitiless Carnage, draw a bunch of cards, get them back with Aftermath Analyst. If you have Scavenger's Talent out as you're doing this, you can probably just mill your opponent out of the game. If you think about it, you start with 60 cards in your deck, but the game's going on, people are drawing cards, you draw your opening hand, you probably need about roughly 20 things sacrificed to mill your opponent's entire deck. That seems very realistic with some of the Pitiless Carnage loops. So we'll have to wait and see what this looks like after rotation. Obviously, losing the Streets of New Capenna fetch lands really powers down Aftermath Analyst, so maybe it just won't be good enough anymore, but that's the kind of stuff you can do with this card. Could also try to do like some Micro Tyrant shenanigans with the sack outlet, where Micro Tyrant gonna make you a ton of tokens on your end step based on how many cards you had go into your graveyard, how many permanents you had go into your graveyard from anywhere. So you could theoretically like sacrifice a bunch of tokens to trigger the Scavenger's Talent to mill your opponent a bunch, and then on your end step you're gonna get all these tokens back with a Micro Tyrant anyway. Then you can do it again the next turn to mill your opponent a bunch and just mill your opponent out of the game. So I'm really excited about all the brew around potential. Also works really well with Altar of Dementia. Altar of Dementia, already a good sack outlet for mill decks, because you can sack a creature to mill equal to its power. If you have a Scavenger's Talent on level 2 with Altar of Dementia, you kind of double up your milling potential. So I think Scavenger's Talent one of the cards I'm most excited to build around in the set. I'm not sure the best way to use this card, but I can't help but think that level 2 on Scavenger's talent is going to be an ability that leads to some brand new combo decks, and we haven't even really been talking about level 3, just potentially reanimating your best creatures every turn. We haven't even talked about that. We're just focused on the mill combo. So I think Scavenger talent, despite a relatively powered down first level, it's cheap to play, it's cheap to level up, and in the right deck, it can do some really ridiculous things. We also got a new blue sorcery in Portent of Calamity. So blue and X for a sorcery. This is reveal the top X cards of your library. For each card type, you may exile a card of that type from among them. So artifact, enchantment, planeswalker, creature, land, etc., etc. Put the rest in your graveyard. You may cast a spell from among the exiled cards without paying its mana cost. If you exiled 4 or more cards this way, then put the rest of the exiled cards into your hand. So Portent of Calamity, I'm not sure how good this card is. I think this card is going to be very risky. There's going to be times when you cast this for enough mana and hit the right things that this will essentially win you the game by letting you cast something massive for free and drawing a bunch of cards. There's also going to be times when you dump like 5-6 mana into this and you only hit 3 different card types and it just is like a really expensive sorcery speed draw 3 and it kind of loses you the game. So I think this is a very like high risk, high reward style card. What it reminds me of the most is actually Aminatu's Augury. I've seen this a lot on Commander Clash because Phil loves this card. Aminatu's Augury, for 8 mana, exiles the top 8 cards of your library. You get to put a land into play, and then until the end of turn, for each non-land card type, you can cast a spell of that type from among the exiled cards without paying its mana cost. Portent of Calamity kind of reminds me of like the standard version of this. Also kind of reminds me of Epiphany at the Drown Yard, which is a card that got some hype. It's like this graveyard filling card advantage engine and then didn't really ever do anything. It wasn't actually good enough. So I'm really on the fence about this one. I think if you can make a ton of mana, the card's probably going to be insane. Like, I can see how this could be Aminatu's Augury at home. In Commander in specific, if you're casting this for 10 mana, 12 mana, and your deck is like a relatively reasonable mix of card types, you should hit at least 4 different card types. And then you're able to like cast something for free, generate a bunch of card advantage, probably still worse than Aminatu's Augury, but still a pretty powerful effect. If you want a worse comparison, it's kind of a Troxa, but you trade in its big life-linking, flying, death-touching, vigilant body for kind of nothing, I guess. The ability to maybe cast a card for free if you actually run well enough. I think if you're going to be dumping like 7 mana into this, I would rather just cast a Troxa, though, and know that the floor is higher. Part of what makes a Troxa good is even if a Troxa goes poorly and you only hit 3 different card types, which I've definitely done with a Troxa before, even if you do that, at least you had a 7/7 flying vigilant stuff lifelinker. Portent of Calamity doesn't have that. If you dump 7 mana or 10 mana into this and you whiff and you don't get to cast something for free, you're probably going to end up losing the game more or less because you just lost so much mana for nothing. The upside of this card, though, is there is some flexibility here. So you can cast Portent of Calamity for 3 mana, and as long as you hit 2 different card types and you don't double up on lands or creatures or spells, it's kind of a divination. Or you can cast this X3 for 4 mana and hopefully hit some different card types and draw 3 cards for 4 mana. Of course, there's still going to be the risk, right? There's going to be those times when you're like, I'm in a divination, and you cast this and you hit 2 lands and you get 1 land and you're really sad. But I do like that the card is flexible. That's the power of the X casting cost. I think the challenge in Standard is going to be, can you build a deck that realistically has enough different card types to get free spells with this? For this card to be good, you really need to get that free spell, which means you need to hit 4 different card types, which means you need to cast this for at least 5 mana, probably more than that to guarantee that it works. And the answer is, I'm just not sure that it's worth the work. You can play some battles and some planeswalkers and some creatures and lands and instants and sorceries and try to play an even mix and try to make it work that way, but I'm still not sure that's going to be worth the effort to like play all these cards unless your deck wants them anyway. But if you're playing cards your deck doesn't really want to try to turn on Portent, you're probably not going to have a good go of it. There is an incredibly high ceiling here, though. Think about in Modern. This could be 5 mana, put Emrakul into play from your deck, and you can kind of cheat on the card types a little bit. it by playing cards that are multiple types. Like Courser of Krufix is an enchantment and a creature. A Frogmite artifact creature. Bitter Blossom is a tribal or kindred enchantment. So if you play cards that are multiple types, it really helps increase the odds that you're going to be able to cast a card for free. Because let's say you hit Courser of Krufix and Frogmite, normally that'd be bad because you're like, oh, I hit 2 creatures, that's not helping me up my different card types. But then you can choose to use Frogmite as a creature and Courser of Krufix is an enchantment. So there are ways you can kind of try to build around it. Still, I'm not saying this is going to be a thing people are doing competitively in Modern. Don't hear me wrong, but it could be a good against the odds episode at least. The other place I think this card is actually pretty good is in Commander, and I've just played against Phil playing Aminachu's Augury so much in Commander that I have a very healthy respect for this card. And while Portent of Calamity is in almost all cases going to be worse than Aminachu's Augury because it's only ever going to cast one thing for free, when Aminachu's Augury lets you cast one of each card type for free, it is still a pretty powerful effect, and in Commander, it's pretty easy to make a lot of mana, so you can make 20 mana and dump it all into this and go super deep in your deck and find that Omniscience or whatever you need, the Expropriate that's going to close out the game. So Portent of Calamity, I really like this card, and I like this card because I don't know if this card is good. I think this card could be like broken, and it could be unplayable. My guess is it's more likely to be unplayable than broken. If I had to pick, it's like 10% busted, 90% unplayable. But I like that this card isn't just super straightforward. It's not a card that's like, oh, just put it in otters and it'll be good in otters. Put it in rabbits, it'll be good in rabbits. It's actually a pretty interesting brew around that if you can find a way to break it, could be really powerful. But it's going to take some work to make that happen. We also got a ridiculous land, an absurd land. This land, I am very convinced, is somewhere between good and like one of the best cards in the format in Fountainport. So it's a land. It comes into play untapped. It taps for a colorless. You can pay 2 and tap it and sack a token to draw a card. You can pay 3 and tap it and pay a life to make a 1/1 blue fish creature token. You can pay 4 and tap it to create a treasure token. So Fountainport, if you think about what this card is, it's kind of like a war room. Yeah, you need to have a token, but it can make tokens. But it's a land that can draw a card mixed with Mirrex, which happens to be one of the most played lands in Standard. It's almost in half of decks. And that's making a 1/1 Might token that does have Toxic, but it can't even block. I think the fish in general is going to be better than that. And then you get the option of maybe making some treasure tokens. So I think the card, power level wise, is literally off the charts. I think this card is Standard staple, going to show up in a ton of decks. Like, it's getting so much value out of your mana base. And with Mirrex already being so good, I don't know why this card wouldn't see play. It's kind of like Trading Post almost on a land, and I love Trading Post. It's not that good anymore, but it's just so much different value. If you need a blocker, you make the fish. If you need an attacker, you make the fish. If you need some cards, you can sack the fish to draw some cards, and then I guess sometimes you make a treasure. I think the treasure mode is the mode that you use the least on this, but still there could be implications of it. I will say, the flavor of this card is a little bit weird. The appearance on Bloomburrow might not be quite as good appearance as we thought. Little awkward that it's sacking your offspring. I don't know. Tender Wild Guide, maybe not quite as tender when it's sacrificing its baby at the Fountainport, but still, flavor fails aside, I absolutely love this card. It seems so good for like the Simic Cookie deck in Standard. It's worth pointing out the token you can sack doesn't have to be a creature token, so this can be sacking food tokens and treasure tokens along with your actual creature token and offspring to be a bad baby making parent on Bloomburrow. But I think the card can show up kind of across archetypes. If you look at Standard right now in Mirrex, it shows up everywhere. It's in control decks, like Blue-White Control with Wandering Emperor. It's in the most aggressive decks in the format, like Boros Convoke. It's in mid-range decks, like various Shieldred piles. I think this is just better Mirrex. Yeah, you gotta pay some life for the token, but the token can block and it draws you cards. So I would not be surprised if Fountainport was the kind of card that we see show up as a couple of copies, kind of across archetypes in Standard. It is going to be at its best in a token deck where you can power up that first mode with other cards and you don't have to like make a fish and then sack the fish. But if Mirrex can be a staple for pay 3 tap, make a token that can't even block, I think that Fountainport is like so much better than that. We even see it maybe show up in Pioneer where it can work with Transmogrify, where you need ways to put creatures on the battlefield that aren't creatures so you can control what you Transmogrify into. Fountainport's another way to get that done. And then in Commander, it's great in token decks for sure. And if you look at like EDH Rec, of the 5 most popular themes that people build decks around in Commander, number 1 right now is treasures, and number, I want to say 4 is tokens. So those are some of the most powerful played themes in the entire Commander format, and Fountainport is perfect for that. In a token deck, you got so much fuel where this is a very cheap way to draw cards while you're cashing in a relatively useless 1/1. In a treasure deck, you can do the same thing. Having your treasures not just make mana, but turning the cards with Fountainport is really, really strong, but I think the card might even be better than that. Right now, and maybe I'm too high on this card. I know it's spoiler season. I get super hyped for new cards. But right now, I'm thinking of this card as a card that I would just jam in pretty much any deck. Probably not 5 colors, maybe 4 colors. But like monocolor decks, 2-color decks, 3-color decks. I think this is good enough. Even if you're not a token deck. Even if you're not built around it. Kind of like a Reliquary Tower. Where I think this just offers so much value by itself. And you're probably incidentally going to, make a treasure now and then or whatever. I think it might be worth it, even in just a generic deck, outside of those treasure decks and token decks it really supported. So Fountainport, kind of a ridiculous land. Like, okay, I can't believe I'm saying this, but when we look back a year from now, Fountainport more played than 3 Tree City. I know I was really hyped for 3 Tree City, and I still am. Nick those for creature types is kind of wild, but I think Fountainport, as far as like competitive play, is actually just going to have way more homes and see more play than 3 Tree City does. As far as reprints, we actually got a bunch today. So we have Fabled Passage, just a upgraded Evolving Wilds essentially. Land comes into play on tap. You can tap it and sack it, search for a basic, put on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. If you control 4 more lands, you get to untap that land. So Fabled Passage, last time we saw it was, well, originally we saw in Eldraine, also came in Core Set 2021. So it's been 2 or 3 years since we've had it in Standard. It saw a lot of play last time it was in Standard. It's essentially somewhere in between an Evolving Wilds, which is kind of like the super common limited version of the effect, and then Prismatic Festa, which is like the modern only, really top tier version of that effect. But Fabled Passage is high enough on that list that in Standard, it will see a ton of play. It's just great fixing, plus we're losing like all the Streets of New Capenna fetch lands, so if you're trying to do like Aftermath Analyst shenanigans, you're going to need fetch lands to actually make that work. In Fabled Passage, at least based on what we saw last time it was in Standard, it's actually way better than that. It's a card you can just play in like any 3-color deck. Sure, in the early game, it's going to be Evolving Wilds, but it's kind of like a slow land in the sense that, yeah, in the early game, it's going to come into play tapped, but then later in the game, it turns into a very powerful fetch. It's getting your mana right away. Also worth mentioning, Sunspine Links is a thing, and I am very scared of this card, and there might be an argument that because of Sunspine Links, if this card actually sees a lot of play, getting basic lands might actually be going up in value in future Standard, just so you don't take so much damage for the links. But Fabled Passage, it's a really good card. It's not super expensive, like $6-7 or something, but still a solid card. See a lot of Standard play. Super glad it's coming back. We also got Banishing Light, which I want to shout out because it's kind of an iconic card, although honestly, Banishing Light isn't really as good anymore. There's just too many ways to deal with it. Like 10-15 years ago, Oblivion Ring style removal was like S tier competitive removal that a lot of decks played. Now I go out of my way to avoid cards like Banishing Light because I expect that most decks are probably going to have a way to blow it up, turning into like temporary removal rather than permanent removal. We also got a bunch of special cards that are coming with Bloomburrow. These are the special guests from the set. So if you don't know special guests, every time there's a new set, there's a cycle of a bunch of these. They're reprints with art that are themed after the set. They show up across booster products. You get them in collector boosters, get them in play boosters. Last I heard, though, they dropped the drop rate of these cards in play boosters by quite a bit, to the point where they're showing up in like 1-point-something% of packs now. So they're going to be pretty scarce. You'll get one of these, based on those numbers, like 1 every 3 boxes or something, maybe a little bit more frequently than that. But these cards, they look really cool. We get to see like Ledger Shredder return as mousy Swords to Plowshares. Rat Colony probably be expensive because people love their rat colonies. Sylvan Tutor, the big winner price-wise. It's like a $40 creature tutor. So these cards, something you can hope for if you open a booster pack, plus nice customization options for Commander. We also got a whole bunch of the Imagined Critters. So the Imagined Critters, these are another set of reprints that are supposed to be old characters that are in the Bloomburrow style. If that sounds a lot like Special Guests, it is a lot like Special Guests, except these are only found in collector boosters, although Wizards did confirm today that they're going to be coming to Magic Arena, and one of the cards that we saw earlier is Jace the Mind Sculptor, which, if I'm understanding this right, means Jace the Mind Sculptor going to be legal on Arena in Timeless for the first time ever. These cards, some of them are really cool, like seeing Teferi as a bird, or Narset Parter Veils as a bird is really cool, or Karn as a tree folk, but I will say, I'm actually kind of disappointed with these cards. The art is amazing. The card selection is fine. The problem I have with these cards is the first ones that we saw were planeswalkers reinterpreted as animals, which I thought was pretty neat. So that's what I was kind of expecting. I was expecting like Snapcaster Mage, but it's a moose, or a Dark Confidant, but it's a giraffe, something like that. But it turns out a lot of them are kind of what they are. It's like Gitrog Monster, which is already a frog, but now it's a slightly more Bloomburrow-y frog, or Baleful Strix, whose art I love, but it was already a bird, and now it's just a different take on a bird. So I was expecting them to feel more different. I was expecting more human characters reinterpreted as animal characters, but instead we got a lot of animal characters that were reinterpreted as slightly different takes on themselves. But still, I mean, the cards look really good. The art's spectacular. There's some good reprints in there. We also got all the new starter kit cards. So this is a new player product. You buy like 2 complete pre-con decks, play them against each other. These cards are legal in standard, but I don't think they'll be super relevant for standard. They're pretty powered down for the most part. The one exception may be classification. We have seen certain decks that can take advantage of an aura that gives a creature +20/+20. So if there's some sort of combo kill with classification where you're like classification flinging or something, then it could see play. Otherwise, I don't think any of these cards are especially relevant for standard. In the world of lower rarity cards, there's a few worth mentioning, including Patchwork Banner. So Patchwork Banner, oh man, you know I love my 3-mana mana rocks, and this is a really good one for specific decks. So 3-mana artifact. When it enters, choose a creature type. Creatures of the chosen type get +1/+1, and you can tap to add 1 mana of any color. So this is a mana rock that for commander in specific, not really talking standard here, although maybe it could work in specific standard decks, but it's going to be very, very good in tribal decks in specific. It reminds me of Heraldic Banner, which actually sees an odd amount of play in Commander, and in a lot of ways, Patchwork Banner is actually just better, right? Depending on the deck. Heraldic Banner really wants you to be a monocolor deck, and it pumps everything of that color, makes a mana of that color. Patchwork Banner doesn't care about color, it just cares about creature types. The big upside is it gives +1/+1 rather than +1/+0, so it is a better Anthem effect. So this is a card I think if you're playing a tribal deck in Commander, you're probably just always going to play it, and it's going to be worth it. In Standard, I don't think the card's going to be super good, but I could see it showing up maybe in Squirrels. Rabbits might be the best home in the like most go wide of the Bloomburrow creature types. That's where Patchwork Banner could actually be pretty good. Like imagine turn 3, Patchwork Banner, ramping you into Season the Burrow on turn 4 to make 5 1/1s, except they're actually going to be 2/2s. That's a lot of power in a really, really fast start, except then your opponent untaps and Sunfalls and you get really sad. But discounting that, it is a really powerful line. So I think Patchwork Banner, fringe standard implications, but a new all-star that you will see if you're playing, it doesn't even really matter. Elves, dragons, squirrels, choose a creature type. If your deck is built around those in Commander, this is a 3-mana mana rock that you should play every single time, and it's only an uncommon, so hopefully it's going to be pretty cheap. We also got Honored Dray Leader, a 3-mana 1/1 trampling squirrel warrior. This is when it enters, put a +1/+1 counter on it for each other squirrel in food you control, and then whenever another squirrel or food enters, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So Honored Dray Leader just gets really, really big. If you're playing a squirrel deck and going super wide, even like the baseline, right? Let's say you go 1-drop squirrel, 2-drop squirrel into Honored Dray Leader. It's going to be a 3-mana 3/3 trampler, but then it's going to grow whenever you play future squirrels or future foods. So I think this could actually be a constructed playable card, especially with trample thrown in. I think this card can scale really, really quickly. The problem is it would get chump blocked if it didn't have trample, but since it has trample, I think you just scale this and then smash your opponent. The food part is a little bit weird, but it is cute with Yagra. Plus, it can make it work in just like random food decks. We've seen some decks that are really good at making food, like Academy Manufacture decks that make tons of food tokens. Honored Dray Leader can be a nice finisher there as well. So this card in Squirrels or in food could be a reasonably effective 3-drop. We also got another class enchantment in Blacksmith's Talent. So 1 red mana, level number 1, when it comes into play, it enters and creates an equipment artifact token named Sword. With equipped creature gets +1/+1 and equip 2. So nice and simple there. It's just straight up sword. And then for 3 mana, you get to level 2. This says at the beginning of combat on your turn, attach target equipment you control to up to 1 target creature you control. And then level 3 for 4 more mana. During your turn, equipped creatures you control have double strike and haste. So Blacksmith Talent by itself not a very good card. Like, making a sword is just not that exciting. +1/+1 and 2 to equip, not a very good equipment. The exciting part is being able to equip for free on your turn. We saw Fighter class as another class that cared about equipment, and it has seen fringe play, specifically in like Pioneer Hammer time decks, where this gives you a tutor that can find your hammer. Blacksmith's Talent could serve a similar role. This is like the class Sigarda's Aid, essentially. It is going to be 4 total mana, right? You got to play it for 1 and then level it up for 3. But once you get to that point, it's a way that you can just stick your hammer on your Fireblade Charger or whatever for free, which is really, really powerful. Not going to make it in Modern. There's just better options in Modern. But in Pioneer, I think this might make the cut, in part because Hammer Time needs to be in Red anyway, because Red gives it the best 1-drops like Fireblade Charger that you really want to put the hammer on. So I think this could show up in some numbers in Pioneer Hammer Time. Is it enough to make Pioneer Hammer Time into like a top tier deck? That remains to be seen. I wouldn't go that far, but I do think the card's good enough to see play in that deck. We also got a new black removal spell in Feed This Cycle. So 2 mana instant. It says the additional cost to cast this spell, either forage or pay 1 black mana, and then you destroy target creature or planeswalker. So Feed the Cycle, I think, is notable, just because I'm going to go out on a limb, and I don't even know if I'm going out on a limb. This might just be obvious, but I think this is just going to see more play when it's all said and done than Fel, which has gotten a lot of hype for its like cleanness, it's getting the promo and everything. But I think Feed the Cycle is just a better card in most decks in most metas. So I think when we look back on Bloomburrow Standard a year from now, 2 years from now, my expectation is that Feed the Cycle will be the card that sees more play out of these 2 cards, because being instant is just so important. Yes, if you don't have a food token or some cards in your graveyard to exile, it is going to be 3 mana, which makes it like a Hero's Downfall, which we've seen Hero's Downfall isn't that exciting. And honestly, both of these cards are probably just worse than Go for the Throat or Bitter Triumph, so maybe neither one of them sees much play. But if I had to choose just one of these cards to put in my deck, I'm going to go with Feed the Cycle. I think it's just a better card overall than Fel. Next up, we have Blooming Blast, which is going to be super good in mono red in Standard. So 2 mana red instant. Says deals 2 damage to target creature if a gift was promised, and the gift is a treasure token. It also deals 3 damage to that creature's controller. So this is essentially a very cute mousy twist on Searing Blood and Searing Blaze. These removal spells that deal 2 damage to a creature, well, in Searing Blaze's case, can actually deal 3 damage, but deal damage to a creature and also hits the opponent's face. I think if you're playing in Modern or whatever, which these cards do see play all the way back to Modern, you're probably going to stick with Searing Blaze because of fetch lands, but I think Blooming Blast might actually just be better than Searing Blood. It's a little bit awkward to give your opponent a treasure, but the upside is Searing Blood deals 2 damage to a creature, and if the creature dies, it does 3 to the opponent, which means if your opponent doesn't have a small creature, you can't burn face. Blooming Blast doesn't have that restriction. It's 2 damage to a creature, and if you give the gift, it also deals 3 damage to its controller. So you can send this at a Sheoldred or something just to get 3 damage at your opponent's face. All this to say, though, this card is going to be everywhere in Standard. I think this is going to be, worst case, a very popular mono red / Burrow / mouse style sideboard card, and I would not be the least bit surprised if this was like a 4 of main deck card. Assuming 2 damage to a creature kills enough stuff in the early game, it's just so good for any sort of aggro deck where you can take one of your opponent's creatures off the board and also hit your opponent's face. Finally today, we get a bunch of draft chaff, stuff that you should check out over on MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end, not only of our daily Bloomburrow spoilers for today, but I believe of our daily Bloomburrow spoilers for the main set overall. So we'll have to see. There might still be a few commons and uncommons to trickle out. If there's enough, I'll do a video tomorrow. Otherwise, Thursday is pre-con day, and Tomer's away this spoiler season, so I'm going to be covering all 4 of the new Commander precons over on the MTGGoldfish Commander YouTube. So even though we're kind of wrapping up main set stuff, keep an eye out for that on Thursday, probably some on Friday too, since there's 4 decks and it's going to take a minute to do all the videos, but keep an eye out for all of those on the Commander channel. Anyway, it was a big one today. We got a lot of cards, some really incredibly powerful stuff. Let me know what you're most hyped about in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? We can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the game where we found out what the best modern deck of all time was, Hogak or Nadu.